Happy Halloween and welcome back to Talk Gnosis and welcome back to Talk Gnosis, Mr. Osborne. Hi, Michael.
Hello.
We've got Michael back for an exciting bonus Halloween show. We're going to be talking about a movie that I quite enjoy. I'm a big Hammer film buff. I've seen all of the Hammer films at some point, a lot of them 20 or 30 years ago. But we're talking about 1958's Dracula. It's a heck of a movie, but it's not just relevant to the season, folks. It's not just because it's Halloween season. But Michael has noticed some very interesting symbolism, some very interesting messaging in the film. So we're going to take a look at that. We're going to decode it. We're going to find out the esoteric secrets of 1958's Dracula. So, Michael, we'll just jump right into it. What first drew you to notice and analyze the occult symbolism in Hammer's 1958 Dracula? And I'm going to add to that question, which is, of course, most horror movies, supernatural horror movies, have an aspect of the occult to them, but a lot of the time it's window dressing, it's fairy tales, it's the invention of the author or the director, what have you. But you notice something that's perhaps authentic to esoteric, mystical, and occult traditions. So tell us how you stumbled across it.
Yeah, and it concerns the astrological floor plan or floor chart that's in the very end of the film where Van Helsing destroys Dracula. I mean, the thing about the Hammer franchise, of course, is that they're not so much horror films as horror fantasy. And I think that's what attracts a lot of people to them, actually. This idea that the film sets are clearly that. The backdrops are painted castles. They use a lot of blue filter in the forests because they're filming in the middle of the day and want you to think it's dusk. And I mean, the reality is most of these films, just about all of them, and particularly for a very long time anyway, starting for 1951, were filmed in a house at Bray Studios in Hertfordshire in England. It was the same place. So a lot of Hammer films have very small rooms. They have a sort of intimate and sort of enclosed feel about them. And while this particular scene at the end of Dracula, which incidentally, directed by Terence Fisher, of course, and the wonderful Terence Fisher, and it's known as the horror Dracula in the United States and Canada. It's Dracula in the rest of. Okay, so it's the horror of Dracula in the US. So there we have it. And there's this floor chart. And of course, Dracula gets up to his usual sort of sadosexual depravities throughout the film, but not in a very sort of late 1950s way, So there's a lot of imagination. It's horror fantasy for most people. And then, of course, there are these fairly sort of occult clues in the film itself. Now, Dennis Wheatley was a close friend of Christopher Lee and of members of the production team, and he often used to actually participate and sit in at the filming of particularly the early, not the early Hammers, but the other ones in the 50s and early 60s. And Christopher Lee himself was also something of an expert on the occult. And if you look him up on YouTube and things like that, you'll see some very interesting interviews that he gave down the years in relation to that. So there's some fairly sort of interesting symbols and hints going on actually in the film. And it did make me think, because I've watched it. I've watched most of Hammer films like you, being a bit of a buff. You don't notice these things, but it's like once you know what you're looking for, it sort of stands out very much. It's sort of apparent, and you'll notice that when we watch the clip, actually, particularly with regard to this thing. So what I had to do then was research actually a little bit more about this astrological chart. And there's some interesting findings that I've come up with. And they must link to the likes of Wheatley and Lee and some of the other people that were involved, I think, in the production of the film in one way or another.
Yeah.
So that's in the know. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, for an argument against this chart, this astrological symbolism, this circle that we see at the climax of the film, how it's not just window dressing it. Somebody put a lot of work into this this astrological symbol that's on the floor and plays such a big role, right? So
yeah, and someone knew what he was doing, right? Do you want to play the clip? So you've got a scene where Van Helsing is finally defeating Dracula in Dracula's crypt, or there's a room set aside where there's a very long table, drawn curtains at the east, because that's where the sun will be rising as the evening ends. So Dracula's raced back. Or rather, sorry, they've raced, haven't they, to rescue the heroine in distress, and night's fading, so Dracula's basically sort of like belting in out of there to try and beat that, having failed in his endeavours to bury her alive, which is quite a dark theme actually. but he doesn't succeed. It's like, if you can't have her, nobody can, sort of thing. But now he fails, and it shows you just how villainous and evil that he is. And of course, Helsing pursues him through the ruse. Where it's Brace Studios. It's meant to be a castle, and eventually, the two protagonists meet up in this chamber, where there's an astrological floor chart. There's a globe next to it, the long table with drawn curtains, and Van Helsing eventually forms a cross out of two candlesticks, paralyzing the Dracula vampire, and then makes a dash for the curtains and tears the veil down, and then the sunlight comes in, of course, and immolates Dracula. So in a sense, the scene is a sort of mythologized, if you like, metaphor of the struggle between good and evil, and it has strong alchemical and it has strong astrological overtones, because if you're careful, and I had to research this quite well, it wasn't simply just trying to find anything about that zodiac sign, which is hard to do on the internet, but it was also obviously taking stills from the movie as well and trying to get a good look through screenshots. And what's interesting is that Dracula is actually defeated and dissolves in the sign of Aquarius. So you have the sign for or rather Aquarius is the element of water, but of course it's the astrological air sign. And then you have the sun coming through the window. So you have a combination of the if you like, imagery of water and fire evaporating, immolating Dracula into air. And of course, there's a residue that's left. And then ultimately, as that blows away in the wind, we're left with his ring. Again, plumb in the sign of Aquarius. Now, are these things coincidental? Well, if they are, then why have an astrological floor chart? And why have those particular quotes that are in there? What did you make of it?
Yeah, I don't know if your interpretation is 100% correct. We'll never know, right? Because the people involved are dead. But it's so deliberate, Michael, and it is the kind of thing that obviously set directors take a lot of pride in what they do. But this is next level, right? This is something that would have taken a lot of time and energy, and we're talking about a low budget. So there is something deliberate going on. I think you're 100% correct. And again, the quotes, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of work to get those quotes and to put them in there. That's very deliberate. And again, if you're just doing some window dressing, some set dressing, that it's not uncommon for horror movies. They'll draw a circle, they'll open up a book of on witchcraft or the occult, and they'll grab some random symbols, right? They'll throw them in. But that doesn't seem to be what's going on here, right? This is time, effort on a production that didn't have a very big budget and was moving at a pretty fast clip, right?
But the fact that Van Helsing actually grabs candlesticks, two luminaries, and holds them in the sign of the cross is telling us that Dracula is being held within its power, and not for superstitious reasons, but because it's a symbol of his privation in the created order of things, albeit that he's essentially spirit incarnated in flesh as a man. This is part of the mythology of the vampire, but there's a serious side to it too, as you can imagine. So the cross itself, I mean, it's telling us, as we'll find out from the quotes I'm about to read, it represents time, not just in a linear way, but also in the sense of the outpouring of the divinity down from the higher echelons of the created order, all the way through down to earth. So there's a sort of Kabbalistic influence going on in there too. And he's held by that. It represents time and light, actually, which holds him in place before the actual element of fire with the light of the sun sort of rips him up and destroys him. Now, the cross is also representative of the four cardinal points as well, of course. So it's the totality of the earth and of creation. I mean, the interesting thing about that, actually, the floor cloth has very strong resemblance to the SRIA Zelator floor cloth. Okay, it's used in the second half of the Zelator ceremony. And the SRIA call it the center of the earth, or sometimes the center of the universe. All right, and even from an Elukovian point of view, the astrological aspects, they represent the process when they work on the planetary energies all the way from the Earth up to Saturn. So again, if you have the linear, but you also have the corresponding up and down influences, which represents all of the planetary influences as well as the elemental influences in creation. And these forces are obviously directly influencing the earth, and Dracula is subject to those rules. Okay, just the same as we are. So the first stage is the moon. It controls, as we know, the gravitation on Earth, and so do the other planets. They have their influences too. So then, going to this, the outer circle has the Greek in it. Now, I could only, because it's difficult, you can't actually see it in the film. I mean, this is part of the problem, really, to some extent. So there was a bit of research, digging around, looking for old articles, and eventually I found the translation for that. It's taken from the Iliad, Homer's Iliad. And the quote is, in English, "For the spirit of men upon the earth is such as the day the Father of gods and men brings upon them." Okay, remembering, of course, Dracula's destroyed by the light of the day. And the Latin quote in English is from a fellow that lived in the period of 1200 to 1270, around that sort of time, known as Bartholomew the Englishman. It's called that because he lived in Germany and happened to be English. And the quote is taken from one of his treatises. And it says, "And earth first bore starry heaven, equal to herself, to cover her on every side, and to be an ever sure abiding place for the blessed gods." Now, what do you make of that, Jonathan? What are your initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously the Iliad is quite well known. Sorry, I said the Odyssey before. I think I was thinking Odyssey because Odyssey has blood drinking spirits.
Yeah, actually, sorry, it was the Odyssey.
Yeah, sorry, it is the Odyssey. Okay, yeah,
It's the Odyssey.
You know, that's very well known.
Yeah.
You know, that's the kind of thing that people who worked on the film would have been studying in school. But to be honest, I like to think of a well-read, educated person. I'd never heard of Bartholomew the Englishman. We're getting into some really obscure stuff here, right? Relatively obscure. So somebody must have put a lot of time and effort to find this quote. And I think the second quote as well connects to that first quote, right? Where there is this order that can seem invisible to us. And this order at the same time can constrain any kind of evil, even though that evil may seem to be incredibly powerful, may seem to be dominant, may seem to be overcoming, right? At the same time, this evil is constrained. And of course, it's this is made quite obvious with the symbolism of the circle, right? You know, it's we're getting into a literal containment, and just like you were saying, we're talking about the Anno Cohen, the SRIA, the people who don't have knowledge of these particular groups, they're probably familiar with this concept of a magic circle, right? So we're getting almost literalizing these quotes. And of course, both of the quotes mentioned the Earth under the domain of these higher powers of this order. Again, getting quite literal, circle, the globe, what have you. So that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, and you're quite right. So going back to the Odyssey, there's a fella called Aeneas. He's an immoral character. And he's the fella that does errands for the suitors that are trying to persuade Penelope to remarry because Odysseus has been away for a very long time. Now, what happens, Odysseus is disguised by the gods, goes along, discovers the suitors, and this Aeneas tries to do a job for him for money. And he's a pretty strong guy, Aeneas. He's tough. He's immoral, corrupt, and a dodgy character. But he's tough, and no one messes with him. And even Odysseus has been off fighting Cyclops and goodness knows sirens and everything else, is a little worried. And he actually approaches Athena and says, his patron deity, and says to her, "I need the strength to take this guy on." And he does have a fight. They challenge one another to a duel. And with one punch, he breaks Aeneas's jaw and tells him, doesn't kill him, but he's done some serious damage, throws him out of the palace and says, "Away from my family, my wife, get out of here, never darken this doorstep again." So he's put an end to the mischief. And that's that quote from the Odyssey. Okay. And the next one then, with regard to Bartholomew the Englishman. Well, the thing about Bartholomew is that he's writing a treatise. It's taken from his treatise on the properties of things. So it's a metaphysical treatise. and he's understanding creation as taking effect in a top-down continuum, like I was talking to you about, in a vertical way. Okay, so it starts with God, the creator, and then it descends from him to the angels, the fallen demons, the celestial spheres, and Earth itself, through these various stages. And that's how he saw the cosmos. So linear time is something that we only experience in the physical realm. But beyond time, there is this structure, and it streams down. Okay, it streams down from the light that is God. And it gets dimmer and dimmer as the further away in each level or dimension that you go. I mean, you could have a lot of fun with this with a multiverse, couldn't you, really? And I'm sure plenty of people have. So, I mean, he discusses the genesis of time, which is an interesting point in the context of the destruction of Dracula on our chart, because I mentioned that Van Helsing, Peter Cushing, grabs the two candlesticks, and the choice of candlesticks, two luminaries, is not coincidental, but there they are. He crosses them. And of course, they represent these elements as well. We talked about the cardinal points, but we've also got our cardinal elements, which are represented by this totality: fire, air, water, and earth. Okay. And Dracula, of course, is immolated by the light. He is on the symbol for Aquarius, so there's a water element in there too. He disappears into air, and there's this dust of the earth remaining. So the very destruction of Dracula's body and the release of his immortal spirit, I suppose, from the body through its utter destruction in the fire, if you like, the sort of purification of its physical form, in a very sort of theurgical way, a bit like what the Kohanim would have done in the Jerusalem temple when they burned the goats and things, the sacrifices and things like that. It was the destruction of the physical form, corrupt and animal and decadent and prone to aging and all those sorts of things, in releasing it into spirit. Of course, this is happening to Dracula. So it's a sort of a focus, I suppose. You have this sense in that scene in the film where you've got appearance versus reality. You've got this duality going on. And that sums up the whole alchemical process anyway, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it's a profoundly alchemical scene for the reasons I've explained. And I don't know what your views are on this hypothesis. I would love to hear them.
Yeah, I think you're onto something, and all those elements are present in the scene, right? And I think as well, when you're looking at this battle between good and evil, which is pretty easy to see in this scene, pretty easy to see in this movie. You don't have to have any kind of read in. I could see somebody who has this knowledge wanting to put this extra level in, right? To give these depths to this this deepness to this sort of fairy tale horror movie, because we're already doing that theme. We're already telling that story, right?
Yeah.
Well, why not tell it on this archetypical level? Why not add a little bit of this deepness to it? Because, pop culture, fun movies, a horror movie, it more so than ever, pop culture is what our society kind of runs on, right? It's what our society really engages
has. I mean, if you think about fairy tales, I mean, remember we talked about the Hammer. The reason we love them so much, and I don't know about you, I mean, oddly enough, just as an aside, my father asked me what I was doing this evening. I said, I'm going to have a talk, a podcast talk with Jonathan Stewart about Dracula. And he says, Dracula? What's that about? He said, well, I remember you were very interested in it when you were younger. Because even he remembered that I used to, sneak the TV into the room, and I was about 9 or 10 to watch these films, and they used to come on at 11 o'clock at night on a Friday with the volume turned down very low, a sort of a something under the door so the parents didn't see the light of the TV. And I was watching the Hammer films, and of course these would come along. Now, is that because is our attraction to these films, the horror fantasy, because of the horror, or is it because it sort of does something with our imagination so that we identify and attach with these archetypes, don't we, of these dual themes of good and evil, and the imagery of the painted castles and the made up Gothic furniture, and plaster cast staircase that's grey, and all the chandelier and all those sorts of things, and blood that's bright red, not at all realistic, and intentionally so. It's just paint, isn't it? School paint. But that's the fascinating thing about it. Now, fairy tales. I mean, you think about any fairy tale you care to name. The Billy Goat's Gruff, Rumpelstiltskin, whatever they are. There's this theme underlying it, which is quite serious, about the conflict between good and evil, and the triumph of good against adversity, against an apparently stronger foe. And their defeat is often caused by simple solutions. In Rumpelstiltskin, once the princess, or the miller's daughter, I should say, had acquired knowledge of his name, she gained control over Rumpelstiltskin. Okay. And so she was able to weave straw into gold without any further problems. But until that point, he had control. So it's quite a sinister story, but it's something that, again, that children can identify with. And these Hammer films are, if you like, colour mythologized stories that just go back to this deep archetypal interest or commonality that we've all got. And I think that's why they're so popular and remain popular, despite the fact they're not grisly modern horror films. This isn't stuff like Saw or anything like that, So yeah. It's quite different, isn't it? Although they have moments of genuine horror.
Yeah, I just really wanted to quickly, while we're on the topic of myth and fairy tale, read this Jung quote, which is, myths and fairy tales give expression to unconscious processes, and their retelling causes these processes to come alive again and be recollected, therefore reestablishing the connection between conscious and unconscious. The kind of reintegration in a psychological mode instead of a more mystical mode, which we'll talk about later. And, I really like that point, specifically talking about fairy tales or Rumpelstiltskin, right? He's defeated by discovering his true name. These very simple things, right, can give you power over evil. And that's what I also like, sort of outside of the symbolism you've already been discussing. Dracula, one of the later Hammer films, is the Satanic Rites of Dracula.
Mm-hmm.
He is a...
What's the Widmark?
Yes, it almost the satanic figure, and both in the book and some of the other movies, right? He has these incredible superpowers, can even control the weather, but he could be stopped with 2 candlesticks. Very simple, right? The small act. That's also why I don't like, there's all sorts of vampire fiction where the Dracula rules don't work. Maybe they're mutations, or it's sci-fi, or whatever. But I think that rock, paper, scissors, the fact that a vampire can be stopped with a simple cross or some Italian food is very important to the story. And
because it was forced. Yes, you see, because you're right, because it isn't superstition that is preventing Dracula from moving. It's the energy and the force of privation. It's the privation of being caught in time and by light, because it's 2 crossed candlesticks. And the thing, going back to the Satanic Rites of Dracula, I'm so glad you mentioned that. It's 1976, so I think it's a late Hammer film. And it's Richard Widmark. Christopher Lee is absolutely brilliant in that. Could you imagine if he'd played the priest in The Omen instead of Patrick Troughton? Although I do love Patrick Troughton, but still, Lee would have been perfect in that. But in any event, so the thing about that, do you know where that was filmed?
No.
Okay, the Hellfire Caverns.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Now, there's a mausoleum directly above the Hellfire Caverns. In fact, there's a church next to it. So this mausoleum is where the cremated remains of that family, which was unusual for that day and age. Their house is down in the valley. You can see it from the top of the hill where the mausoleum is, and it sits next to the church, and the church is directly above where the altar in the Hellfire Caverns was.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And
I had no idea.
He filmed the movie not in the caves, but they filmed it on top of that hill inside that mausoleum. It's like, unless you know, you know. So that's where they're filming it, in the Hellfire Caverns, or in that area, part of the same infrastructure. So it's the above ground thing going on. And of course, Widmark does defeat Dracula, doesn't he? Not Dracula. It's like a vampire. Yes, it is, isn't it? Yeah. So Lee's there. Yeah. Okay. So this is exactly what's happening. And he defeats him up there. Yeah. So the people that made the film, a couple of things about them, right? So we know about Terence Fisher. I mean, yeah, he was a heavy drinker and all that stuff. Great director and everything like that. Lee and Cushing. Cushing was a member of the Ghost Club. There was an element of he was a big time member of the Ghost Club. He was very interested in that sort of stuff. And there's a fella called Bernard Robinson. He died in 1970. He was the designer of most of Hammer's sets in that period. And I think this was his first or second film, I forget which. He joined them in 1956, which is a year before they started filming Dracula, or the horror of Dracula, depending on where you live. Now, he was an artist, actually, as well as a movie set designer. So it's him that's drawing these castles, a magnificent set, backgrounds to the sets and things like that. So the villages and all that sort of stuff that you can sometimes see in these films with the windows lit up and the moon. I mean, I just think it's great. I mean, we all have David Lean films, don't we? Particularly the black and white ones like David Copperfield, where you've got the graveyard and the old tree. And it's all in the movie set, but it so works. Because it just triggers your imagination. I mean, it's the thing. And then, as I mentioned, there's Wheatley. I mean, of course, because he wasn't actually part of the production crew, but he would have been an advisor. That's why he was there. And he also made great friends with the likes of Robinson and other members of the Hammer team. And there's a fella as well, the script writer, Jimmy Sangster. You've doubtless heard of Jimmy Sangster. Died in 2011. So he was very much interested in the occult. So you have this influence of these different guys, and they're making a fun film for everybody, but a bit like that fairy tale. You can watch it as a good romp between good and evil and enjoy the acting and the fun and all that sort of stuff. But they put little clues in there for other people just to say, well, actually, there's a more serious message going on here. That we're trying to sort of convey.
Yeah. Can you? Okay. So your article connects the film symbolism to the doctrine of reintegration. Obviously, something that you and I have talked about a lot over many shows. But at the same time, every podcast, every video is somebody's first show, right? We're going to have some Dracula fans who are going to be like, oh, I didn't know there was actual mysticism and occult in this movie that I love. Wait, what's reintegration? What is this doctrine? So can you tell us a bit about what reintegration means in the mystical traditions and how it's portrayed in the film?
I think the best place to start, before we move on to that, because it leads into it anyway, is essentially what a vampire is.
Yeah.
Now, they don't exist in the sense that Dracula exists, consuming blood, but it's an allegory for something that does. And in particularly in Southeast Europe, there's a very strong tradition of black magic that pervades. Dion Fortune writes about the existence of black magic and how the soldiers from the Bulgarian army in the First World War, the ones that had been killed, their spirits were left behind on the battlefields, and of course a great deal of havoc and ill will, because they'd learned the ability, the discovery of actually surviving death in a disembodied form. So this is her writing, and of course you have to buy into this whole sort of way of looking at things, but taking it at face value, you can see how those sorts of belief systems in Bulgaria and Romania, on the left path side of things, would influence later vampire myth.
Absolutely.
Okay. And the thing about the vampire is that it requires blood. In reality, they're psychic vampires, and they steal people's energy and life force, their anima. But that energy and life force in the esoteric tradition, in Rosicrucian mystical tradition, is contained in the blood. And that's also the view that the Old Testament priesthood had too, which is why there was animal sacrifice and why the animal was killed and then it was bled dry. And it's a similar reason why there's also the tradition of halal meat in Islam as well. It comes from that. Because the soul or spirit, the life force, that which is eternal, is somehow connected as a junction formed with the blood. And again, it's also why the seat of the soul in Egyptian religion is contained in the heart. And it's also why vampires can only be killed by a stake through the heart. So the mythological vampire is taking blood, because what he's doing essentially is taking the soul and that which is eternal in human form. And so it's a metaphor for that sort of psychic theft of someone's life force and identity. Okay, and in the myth, it's taking their blood. Okay, and that's how it ties in with a lot of the sort of the darker theurgy surrounding things like human sacrifice and all that sort of stuff that used to go on. Now, the Kohanim of the temple abandoned Judaism, or not Judaism, but the Hebrews abandoned that kind of thing, like, way before the captivity. There is obviously the tradition of Abraham and Isaac, where Isaac is being led up to the top of the mount to be sacrificed by his father. And what prevents that is that God sends a ram to take his place. Okay. And so therefore the animal, if you like, substitutes the human in that regard. And and what happens next, of course, is that once the victim, the ram, the goat, the dove, or whatever else they were doing in the temple, has been killed and drained of its blood, is that it's then burned and immolated into dust. And its form, its physical form, is purified in the campfire and becomes the element of air. All right. Now, reintegration. Reintegration is all about the original intended form of man as a spiritual being, the being of light, quote unquote, becoming encamped or trapped in the physical animal form. And people have different views of expressing this and understanding it in terms of evolution, in terms of, as in scientific evolution, how spirit may have influenced evolution, the evolution of man, to resemble its shape and form and things like that, try and lead us to the point where eventually, through a process of reconciliation with God and regeneration spiritually, we can, in the next life, once we've sort of left our physical form, eventually actually reintegrate back into that spiritual form that we were intended to be. Now, people have different views. For me, the original man, Adam, if you like, was like a big super angel, and that's the way I look at it. And the individual sparks of light that represent our immaterial eternal selves will reunify in that collective group soul. That's humanity. Okay. I don't know what your views are within the Johannite Gnostic Church or whatever, but I'd like to hear that in a moment. But so reintegration is a process, if you like, of returning back to our original form, but through a process of scientific evolution as well. So they're contrasting movements, if you like, across. Your views, Jonathan?
Yeah, well, the Johannite Church is very low dogma, right? So the people have all sorts of views, and I kind of, because again, this is, I think we're already kind of talking about this, the phrase, without directly addressing it, but the phrase myth has a bad reputation in common parlance, right? Where instead, what a myth or mythology is, it's a story that can only be told through a story. There's no other way to express it because it's something that can't be understood by the human brain. So I sort of go back and forth to exactly what the human is, where it comes from, and its ultimate destiny. But I am attracted to, I think, in the kind of modes that you're talking about, Michael, that there is this sort of primal unity. The original Adam that we find in the Martianist myth, or that we find in Kabbalistic myths, or the more Gnostic version in the myth of John, where we're sort of contained within Sophia. I kind of like the Secret Book of John version, where what happens is that it's dynamis, which is a very interesting Greek word that means all sorts of things, but it seems to be used to mean, it means energy, for instance. It also kind of means potential, right? So I really like that potential reading, because there is this initial unity, right? And then this dynamis gets trapped in matter, but it's potential. So we're getting back to an original unity with reintegration, but at the same time, something has changed.
Reconciliation, regeneration, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, which you can't have reintegration without mastering those. I mean, the interesting thing, actually, for me, I suppose, listening to that is there's a connection with Jungian ideas about the collective unconscious and archetypes.
Yes.
And of course, the other thing is that we are literally, whether we like it or not, as individuated as we are in terms of our gender, age, race, language, God knows what else that differentiates us. The reality is we're all essentially descended from the same common ancestors. We are literally trillions of cells in a body that is replicated generation after generation after generation from original parents. You, Jonathan, whether you like it or not, are my cousin. And that's the fact, right? And so is everybody else that's listening to this. They're your cousin too. So if that's the case in nature, then why on earth isn't that the case in the realm of spirit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's excellent, Michael. And again, it's just scientific fact, right? So why wouldn't it be reflected? And outside of humanity, at one point before the Big Bang, like everything was contained into one thing, right? Which then exploded. So at one point, the universe was one thing. This is the scientific well, maybe mythos is the best word, but at the same time, it's sort of scientific fact. As well as being radically interconnected. Now, we know due to recent things going on with the environment, with the world that we live in, that human beings are radically interconnected with each other and with the world around us. But this gets into more than metaphor. The actual atoms in our bodies and the electrons and particles are more permeable than we realize. We're constantly exchanging atoms with the world around us. So the human being is not this singular, divorced, independent thing that is like completely outside of the world, society, and universe that it lives in. There's a radical interconnectedness that no matter what your personal beliefs are, it can be proven. Now, exactly, as above, as below, if we can look around and discover this right here, it wouldn't make any sense that on any other dimensions, any other realities, higher realities, spiritual realities, whatever you want to call it, why would it be different there?
It wouldn't. Like, when you break it down, we are this collection of atoms and cells and elements and things like that. And we're like, what are we, 85% water or something? It's quite high. And 98% chimpanzee for that matter. So there is this thing that we share, whether we like it or not, with nature and other life, and even more so with other people. But I was thinking, when you were talking there, I was thinking of Plato's forms, because you have, and we're talking about the satanic rites of Dracula. I think it was the satanic rites of Dracula, if I've got the right form of Richard Widmark in, if that's the one we're talking about, where I know that could be to the devil a daughter, actually thinking about it. I think that's to the devil a daughter. They do tend to merge in a little bit, particularly if you constantly watch them like I do. It doesn't matter. The one where essentially Christopher Lee plays a really bad priest, you've got Richard Widmark on the up of the Hellfire Caverns in this mausoleum. So it's as above, so below. And Plato, of course, was saying that all these things, and if you break it, he didn't know about DNA, but he'd certainly understood that there are these blocks made out of things, essentially material things. But he would say they're an imperfect reflection of a perfect form somewhere else. And so this whole universe and everything in it is but a shadow, an imperfect form of something more perfect elsewhere.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's simply what we would call spirit. And it's just saying that the same things that it's made of exist, but they vibrate at a much higher level than they do here. And so time and entropy and all those other things don't exist. At least they're not perceived, or they're not experienced in the same way. Okay. So yeah, Plato's forms, as above, so below, and this sort of dual thing going on, very much a part of it. And that's all I really had to say essentially about reintegration. And the only other thing really that struck me as important actually about that scene in the film is the fact that after Dracula has been reduced to the dust, it blows away in the air, we have his ring left, don't we? Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's like the magician's ring, isn't it? And it's always there. I think they usually they pass it on to their successor, the person that trained up, if you like, when they die. And so it's there to be picked up by somebody else who will eventually reinstitute Dracula. And of course that does happen, doesn't it? Repeatedly in these Hammer films, as Dracula's brought back into a physical form so he can go about his mischief and aggravation, I think, in the material form again, because you can't do a great deal as a disembodied entity. And essentially that's it. Yes, that's all that's left of him, is then this promise of a sort of anti-resurrection, I suppose you could call it that, in the form of the ring. And the thing about the ring, if you load the picture, will be that it's actually left there in the sign of Aquarius on that chart. Okay.
Yeah.
And make of that what you will in light of what we just discussed. My only concern is we'll talk about the satanic rites of Dracula, and in my head, I think I had The Devil a Daughter in my mind, which is the 1976 Widmark film. But yeah.
So, I mean, I didn't even mention, which I should have at the top of the show, that our discussion is based on an article that you have on your website. So those who are watching at home, they'll see the ticker at the bottom that has the link. It's also going to be in the show notes, what have you. But in the article, so we talked about the cardinal points. And in the article, you mentioned that the self is associated with evil, but in my understanding, in many occult systems, the north is associated with evil, and when you live in Quebec, that makes a lot of sense. Or if you live in other places in the Western Hemisphere, because of course, particularly at this time of the year, the cold winds are blowing from the north, and if you were not in a comfortable, centrally heated home, death literally comes from the north. So why is the self in this particular scene associated with evil?
Well, and not necessarily evil, but perhaps sort of material incarnation and the negative aspects of that, because of course Dracula goes about sucking the blood out of people and doing other things. So there's also there's a sort of sexual excess about Dracula as well, isn't there? And that's very much implied as part of the allure, I think, of the Hammer films. Unlike modern films, where you see he doesn't leave anything to the imagination in Dracula, you kind of know what he's doing, and then he kills them. So there is that. Now, if you think about most Western occult traditions, I mean, it's the opposite to what you're saying, because if you look at the Tree of Life, you obviously have the Keter at the top and Malkuth at the bottom, right? In Swedenborg systems, you've got the divine immensity, and then you've got all the layers down to earth. In Dante, you have heaven, purgatory, and hell, and all the various different dimensions and layers going on from a north-south axis. In Martinism, we look at the universal table. You've got the 7 planets, and they ascend up to Jupiter, and then the beyond, the immensity beyond that, and further spheres and realms. In Elizabethan cosmogony, you have this very top-down, north to south thing where things actually are more perfect the higher they are, and they become more animal, more corrupt and prone to time and decay the further down they go. And in the biblical tradition, Egypt often represents the south. It's seen as the land of privation, of material incarnation, and Cain and his descendants are cast into the south. And is it Ham, when Noah's Ark is grounded? He's cast into the south. Okay, so the south is, in most esoteric and occult Western traditions at least, associated with the more negative, bad side of things. Dracula's seen here. You've got the early morning light from the east. It comes in. You're standing in the west. Dracula's feet and the south, and his head is facing towards it's the other way around, isn't it? So you've got his feet to the north, his head to the south on that astrological chart.
So, so
Yeah.
yeah.
I was going to say
Unfortunately,
in Freemasonry, John. Are you a Freemason?
I'm not. No.
Not no. Okay. Well, in Freemasonry, the northeast corner is important,
Yeah.
and it's also important in terms of the temple architecture in Jerusalem as well. Actually, for that matter, the doors didn't face east west; they faced south north. And the Holy of Holies was in the north. And our practice of worshipping the direction of the east, which has been taken because Christianity is a Jewish heresy at the end of the day, ultimately, is taken from them, and Islam has borrowed it as well because Jerusalem is set in the east. But you do have this north-south trajectory, with the Shekinah in the north, in the Holy of Holies. So yes, I mean there is that. But what I was trying to ask you though was your view on the South then, in regard to that sort of tradition. Yeah, sure. The North is dark in the Northern Hemisphere. It's the other way around in the Southern Hemisphere, of course.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering what your views were on that.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And so when you put it in that, the sort of two dimensionals, right? If we're going to chart it, then the north is always facing up, just like in all the systems that you said. So that does make a lot of sense.
Hellfire caverns to the devil of your daughter. So you've got the caverns underneath, and you have essentially the equivalent of their unholy of unholies. This room, which is tucked away right at the end of these passages, and there's a chamber, and then it leads on to that. And there's also a fictitious river Styx they built down there as well that you cross over. That's significant too, because of course that's where the dead cross, isn't it, into the underworld. And then directly above it is the church on the surface. Yeah.
Yeah. I like that unholy of the unholies. Yeah.
Holy of unholies. And when you come to England, we'll have to go and visit that because it's good fun.
Yeah. I would love to. So unfortunately, we do have to start wrapping up. Although it's always great to talk to you, and of course we could go all day and night. We could go all of Hallowtide. But is there any a good closing question, which is there any other classic horror films you think deserve similar analysis for their hidden esoteric content, or are you going to be coming on next year to talk about the Devil Rides Out?
That is my favorite horror film of all time. I just absolutely love that.
Rules, yeah.
I do, and yeah, is it the Comte de Richelieu? Christopher Lee, it's just fantastic. Yeah, you could well get talking about that because I mean, if we can pick Dracula 1958 apart like this, what must they have done in that film, which is one of Wheatley's own stories? And he'd have been on there on set, sure. For that one, that would be really good. But there's probably a lot more material written about that.
There's got to be, yeah. So okay, well we have a plan for the Halloween special 2025. So 365 days from now, put it in your calendar.
Well, I hope no one's too scared about us talking about Bulgarian black magic and the seat of the soul being in the blood and vampires.
Yes, I don't think so. I think people are going to find it fascinating, and I think as well there's sort of a reassuring. Is reassuring the right word? I mean, straight up, there's just something cool, but also something reassuring that these fun things that we particularly engage with at this time of the year, right? That may seem frivolous, maybe even childish, as we talked about the fairy tale aspects of the Hammer horror films. They're dark fantasies, they're not horror movies per se. That there can be this deeper layer, that there is something really quite profound going on. That if you're not picking up consciously, I would argue is feeding that mythic part of yourself. Sometimes when I talk about occultism and some of the weird things that occultists do, or even some of the weird things that high church people do, because it's we no longer live in a Christian society. I think part of that pageantry, and I hope no one's insulted by that word, is that it feeds the mythic part of ourselves, right? And that's something that even though I said earlier people are particularly immersed in pop culture, at the same time I don't know if this mythic side is being fed in secular society, right?
Right.
And I always like to put a little asterisk on there because maybe people are thinking of making some sort of argument for a return of the combination of church and state, and everybody has to be one kind of religion. But I think there's lots of ways to feed this mythic side of yourself, and it can be through art, and it can be through theater, it can be through fairy tales. But at the same time, I don't think that food is being out there consumed as much. I don't think that people are connecting to that mythic side, and I think that having these deeper messages, if you're not picking it up consciously, the subconscious is picking it up, and it's getting some succor from that. So,
Well, this is the thing. I mean, they can't make Hammer films like that today. You couldn't do it. Did you watch the TV show Hammer? The Hammer TV
no,
show? One series of that in 1980. Absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to check it out.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you must do. I mean, the theme tune's by Roy Skeggs. I think he was the fella that did the Doctor Who theme tune, but the theme tune to the Hammer Horror TV show, fantastic. And the plot's got Peter Cushing in there as an evil, villainous pet shop owner that incarcerates people. There's all sorts. There's a werewolf story, a vampire one. The werewolf one is brilliant because it really plays into mythology. And I remember actually, just very briefly, I know we've got to go, but when I was a kid, I bought a book at a school jumble sale, horror stories for children. But it had one story, and I've been trying to find this story ever since. If anyone knows of it, post it below or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
But it was a story set in Germany where this guy from the modern times sort of wanders into woods and ends up going into some sort of past reality or somewhere sort of in between this day and age and the past, but not quite in the past. It's a sort of mythical, sort of thin place, really. And he's taken in by a family, and they get rather attached to him, and they don't want him to go. And they're actually lycanthropes or lycanthropes, I should say. They're werewolves, and they go back to the present, and they essentially murder his family. And so there's nothing for him to go back to. And then they come back, and it was a horror story about werewolves. And the Hammer TV show I was just talking about, it has a similar sort of story where this couple randomly chance upon a manor house, and they're essentially interested in her, this family and his kids, but they're sort of using her to breed more werewolves. And when she's done her job, she's done away with, and her husband's done away with a lot earlier as well by the woodsman, who turns into a werewolf just as he's about to knock him over the head in the woods. And it's absolutely brilliant. So there's no gore, there's no express sort of like nasty violence or anything like that, but there's plenty of horror, and it works in the mind. They couldn't make that nowadays. I'm sure they just couldn't do it.
Yeah. Well, hopefully somebody will know that short story and will talk about it below. And we got to go, but that reminds me when you're saying authentic werewolf lore, the great The Curse of the Werewolf, which is a Terrence Fisher Hammer 4 film.
Oliver Reed.
Yeah. And he's one of the reasons he's a werewolf is he's born on Christmas Day, which is an ancient tradition. I actually have a friend from Eastern Europe, and she was born on Christmas Day, and she's heard this myth that will cause a werewolf. So.
A lunatic was his father, wasn't he? The mother was thrown into the cell with this bloke. But he'd gone nuts because was he a beggar or something? And the horrible prince cast him, and then Oliver Reed's the son of that. Yeah, I mean, what a werewolf felt.
Yeah.
And this werewolf, yeah.
It's really really good. So folks, if you haven't seen any of this, well, now I have to watch the Hammer film, the Hammer TV series. But folks, if you haven't seen any of these movies, treat yourself this season. So. And, you know, but by the time this goes up, it will be very close to Halloween, probably the day before Halloween. But you know, I have the season last all November. You know, old Halloween is November 11th. You just celebrate the 12 days of Halloween between the 31st and November 11th.
Why watch all the Hammer films?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, give yourself a marathon. Okay, Michael, we should. Yeah. I really love the Amicus films. Again, those were on late.
The Devil's Claw.
So,
The Devil's Claw. Witchfinder General. You don't get better.
That's an excellent movie. Is that one's not Hammer? Witchfinder General?
It's Amicus.
Is that one Amicus?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, we gotta let you go. But Michael, take care. We will talk to you in 365 days about The Devil Rides Out. But knowing you, you'll probably have 3 or 4 new books by then. So we'll have you back on the show to talk about those. So, okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye.